what took me to London and how did I get involved in engineering? Uh, well, it's a bit of a long one, I think, but I'll do my best to try and condense it. From the age of 7, I started to have piano lessons. My mother was a church organist, and actually, I went to the same piano teacher that she had as a young girl when I was growing up in this small cotton town called Mossley in Lancashire. And it was I learned some, my elementary musical theory from those times, but the piano wasn't the instrument that I wanted to be learning to play. I'd seen these groups. I'd seen the Shadows and Hank Marvin at the time, and it was really the guitar that I wanted. So I didn't. The piano lessons didn't last terribly long, but it was really this passion for music that started at that time, through those years, through my sort of early school years, and then being able to finally save up enough money and buy a guitar. And this is really what led me ultimately to London, was through uh, a series of recordings that I made in a local studio with my good friend at the time, Kim Turner, who played drums, and also working with a group that I'd formed at school. And the owner of the studio there used to take trips up to London once in a while. When he'd finished the recordings, he'd actually, some of it he used to master uh, for the vinyl in London, and he kindly invited me to share the passenger seat with him on some of these kind of, for me as a young lad, were very long journeys up to London. But I remember going into some of the studios there at the time, and such as the Beatles had a mastering room set up that was, for a while it was I think it was in Charing Cross, and then another visit when they'd moved to Savile Row, looking there and seeing the mastering room, and looking at studios like Advision and another classic studio called Lansdowne, where I met for the first time. I was probably about 15. Met a guy called Adrian Kerridge there, who was the designer of the Cadac consoles. Now, those trips kind of introduced me into London, and I was so excited to be in a city, because I kind of grew up in the north of England and then subsequently in Torquay, and I think that I was um, I kind of always knew what I wanted to do so young in life, that it wasn't such an issue for me to just pack up and move home when I was 16. And Kim Turner, who I'd been playing with when I think we were about 13 or 14 together, ended up in a group called Cat Iron, that was with his brother Glenn and another fellow called Tony Brinsley. We were all Torquay boys, and I went up to London and spent some time with them during the summer holidays, and ended up at the Marquee Club. And they were supporting a band called Vinegar Joe, which had as the two front vocalists, Elkie Brooks and Robert Palmer. And they had nobody to do their sound, so I volunteered and said, if you haven't got anybody, you'd rather have me than nobody at all. So I actually did the sound for them. And just shortly after we did the sound check, there was a guy that walked through the club, from the back entry, and started to talk to Glenn, who was a guitarist. And Glenn beckoned me over and said, "Oh, I'd like you to come over and meet somebody." And he introduced me to a guy called Phil Dunn, and Phil was an engineer at the Marquee Studios, and he got to chat with him, and we found that we had some mutual family way back in Lancashire, and his auntie used to push me in a chair. It was just an amazing coincidence of how these things, happened at that time in my life and tend to happen even to this day. And Phil invited me into the studio, the Marquee Studios, which sat at the back of the club, and took me and gave me a guided tour and showed me the machine room where they had the 2-inch machine. And this was all like really amazing technology for me, because the stuff I'd been using down in Torquay was like a couple of quarter-inch machines, a couple of Revoxes, and we used to have to bounce things back and forwards between the machines to make those earlier recordings. So seeing this magnificent Ampex machine that held 2-inch tape and had guides and heads that you could put on to bring it to an 8-track situation was just an absolutely incredible thing. And to have 16 tracks to record with was just, I mean, it was like space age. So I was completely, smitten by all of this. And at that moment, I knew where I wanted to be and what I wanted to do. So Phil had kindly said, look, I think that there's a possibility that there could be a job here if you're interested. So I returned after a few days longer with the band. Kim and Glenn and Tony returned back. I returned back to Torquay, all excited, and to tell my parents that I wanted to leave home at 16 and not go to college to do my further education. I wanted to leave, and so that's really what happened. I interviewed and got a job there at the Marquee, and that was really the beginnings of my start in recording.